Have you ever held a memory in your mind so sharp, so clear, that it feels like it could still draw blood? A moment from your past that isn't really in the past at all, but lives in the quiet spaces of your life, whispering reminders of a world that was, and a promise you made to yourself. That's precisely where our story begins tonight, in a place where the past refused to stay buried. I'm Serena, and this is Revenge Pains, where we explore the long, winding roads people walk to reclaim what was taken from them, and how sometimes the most profound revenge isn't about destruction, but creation. The world as it was for Elias Washington in the late summer of 1968 was a fortress built of paper and ink. His office at the NAACP headquarters in Clarendon, Virginia, was small, almost claustrophobic, but it was his sanctuary. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books on law and history, their spines a testament to a lifelong battle waged with intellect and precedent. The air, thick with the smell of old paper, stale coffee, and the sweet, cloying scent of southern humidity, was barely stirred by the lazy rotations of a ceiling fan. Outside, the world was a powder keg of change and resistance, but in here, Elias' world was one of depositions, municipal budgets, and meticulously organized files. It was a fortress of logic he had constructed, brick by brick, to fight the chaos and injustice that churned just beyond his window. As evening bled into night, the amber glow of his desk lamp cast long shadows across his desk, illuminating the columns of figures he was poring over. He was tracing the flow of money, the lifeblood of the state, trying to prove what everyone knew in their bones but couldn't articulate in a court of law, that the system was rigged. He adjusted his glasses, massaging the bridge of his nose, the pressure of the numbers momentarily blurring his vision. And in that brief moment of mental exhaustion, the past broke through. It came not as a gentle memory, but as a sharp, intrusive shard of his childhood. Suddenly, he wasn't a 30-something lawyer in a stuffy office. He was a small boy again, shivering in the drafty, dilapidated hall of the Liberty-colored school. He could feel the splintered wood of the bench beneath his thin trousers, could smell the damp rot and chalk dust. He saw his own small, chapped hands holding a tattered history book, a hand-me-down from a white school, so worn that entire chapters about the nation's founding were simply missing. He remembered the feeling of a promise broken before it was ever made, the promise of an equal education, a fair start. The gnawing hunger for knowledge, and the constant, dull ache of being told, in 1,000 silent ways, that he was worth less. A soft thud on his desk jolted him back to the present. He blinked, the phantom cold of the schoolhouse receding, replaced by the oppressive heat of his office. His colleague, Samuel, stood beside his desk, a weary look on his face. He slid a folded newspaper into the pool of light from the lamp. "You're not going to like this, Elias," Samuel said, his voice low. Elias unfolded the paper. The headline was bold, triumphant. Senator Finch's Educational Opportunity Act hailed as bipartisan triumph. His eyes scanned the article, then the subheadlines, then the coded, carefully chosen language of the summary. To the public, it was being sold as a bill that provided flexible funding to school districts, empowering local leaders to meet unique needs. It was a masterpiece of political spin. But Elias Washington had spent his entire adult life learning to read the language of power, to translate the elegant prose of legislation into its brutal, real-world consequences. He saw the truth instantly. The loopholes were large enough to drive a fleet of new school buses through, but only to certain schools. The discretionary clauses, the allocation formulas, the waiver provisions, it was all there. It was a legal architecture designed to ensure that white schools would receive more funding, more resources, more everything, while black schools would be left to crumble, just as the Liberty-colored school had been left to crumble. His world of abstract legal theory and his unhealed personal history had just collided with the force of a battering ram. This wasn't just another unjust law. This was the ghost of his past, given new life, new teeth, and the full backing of the state legislature. The man behind it, Senator Alastair Finch, was a titan of state politics, a man who spoke of tradition and heritage while expertly wielding the levers of systemic injustice. For Elias, this act wasn't just policy. It was personal. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on the future of a million little boys and girls shivering in schools just like the one that haunted his dreams. The fortress of logic he had built felt suddenly, terrifyingly, inadequate. The fight was no longer on paper, it was in his bones. A few days later, the oppressive humidity of the Clarendon summer seemed to seep through the very walls of the local church, collecting in the cramped basement where the community had gathered. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete, pine sol, and a simmering, collective anxiety. This was where the real consequences of Senator Finch's legislation were felt, not in the hallowed halls of the State House, but in the worried faces of parents, the weary sighs of teachers, and the palpable sense of dread that hung in the room like a shroud. The mood was one of fear and resignation, a script that had been played out for generations. Elias stood at the back, leaning against a support pillar, listening. He knew most of the people here. He saw Mr. Henderson, who worked at the mill and whose daughter was in the 3rd grade. He saw Mrs. Wright, who cleaned houses for 2 of the wealthiest families in town, scrubbing their marble floors while her own son learned from books with torn pages. They discussed the new bill not in the language of legal statutes, but in the language of survival. They knew what flexible funding and local discretion really meant. It meant fewer books, colder classrooms, and another generation being told they were second best. They felt powerless, a small congregation of whispers against the deafening roar of Senator Finch and the state legislature. The weight of history, of countless similar fights that ended in compromise or defeat, was a heavy presence in the room. An elderly woman, her back straight with a lifetime of resilient dignity, rose to speak. Her name was Mrs. Gable. She had been a teacher at the Liberty Colored School for 40 years. She had taught Elias' mother, and before that, his grandparents' generation. Her voice was thin, but it carried a profound authority that silenced the murmurs in the room. "I've seen this before," she began, her gaze sweeping across the faces looking up at her. "Different name, different year, but the same story. They give it a pretty title, talk about opportunity. But the result is always the same. Our children get less. We ask for a new roof, they send a bucket to catch the leaks. We ask for new books, they send a box of throwaways. We have been fighting this same fight our whole lives." She wasn't speaking with anger, but with a bone-deep weariness that was far more piercing. Her words landed on Elias like stones. Listening to her, seeing the nods of agreement from the other parents and elders, he felt a profound shift inside him. The injustice was no longer an abstract legal problem, a puzzle of clauses and precedents to be solved in his office. It had faces. It had names. It was the tremor in Mr. Henderson's hand as he worried about his daughter's future. It was the exhaustion in Mrs. Gable's eyes. His own personal trauma, the shivering boy in the drafty schoolhouse, was not his alone. It was a shared, communal wound, reopened and salted by Alastair Finch's pen. Later that evening, exhausted from the meeting, Elias sat in his small apartment, the television flickering in the corner. A local news program was on, and suddenly there he was, Senator Alastair Finch, holding a press conference on the steps of the Capitol. He looked magnificent, every inch the statesman. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his suit impeccably tailored. He smiled with an easy, confident charm as he leaned into the microphones. "This Educational Opportunity Act is not about division," Finch said, his voice smooth and paternalistic, dripping with false sincerity. "It's about empowering every community in this great state to provide a quality education for all of our children, tailored to their specific needs. It guarantees that every child, no matter their background, has the chance to succeed." Watching him, Elias felt a cold fury rise within him. It was the smugness, the patronizing assurance with which Finch delivered his lies, that broke through Elias' carefully constructed composure. The senator wasn't just passing a discriminatory law. He was insulting their intelligence, gaslighting an entire community into believing the chains he was forging were actually gifts. In that moment, a decision crystallized in Elias' mind. It was no longer a matter of if, but how. The image of Finch's smiling face, the sound of Mrs. Gable's weary voice, and the memory of his own shivering childhood coalesced into a single, unshakable resolve. He drove back to the church. The meeting was over, but a few of the elders, including Mrs. Gable, were still there, cleaning up, their movements slow and deliberate. Elias walked back down the steps into the basement, the scent of stale coffee now mingling with the ever-present damp. He stood before them, and for a moment he felt like that small, uncertain boy again. His voice, when he began to speak, had a slight tremor. "Mrs. Gable, everyone," he started, his gaze moving from face to face. "What you said tonight, you're right. It is the same fight. And for too long, we've been forced to react, to plead, to accept whatever scraps they're willing to throw our way." He took a breath, and as he spoke again, his voice gained a strength that surprised even him. It was a voice filled not with the cold logic of the law, but with the fire of his convictions. "But being on the defense ends now. Senator Finch thinks he's won. He thinks we'll just accept this. He's wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. "I came here tonight to tell you that the NAACP will not just be opposing this law. We are going to challenge it in federal court. We are going to prove that it is unconstitutional, that it is discriminatory, and that it is a violation of the rights of every single child in our community." He wasn't just promising to fight anymore. He was promising to win. "This won't be a fight about budgets and clauses," he continued, his voice ringing with a newfound power. "This will be a fight about our children's future. We won't just ask for repairs. We will demand new schools. We won't just ask for equality. We will dismantle the very foundation of educational inequality in this state. We are going to take down this law, and we are going to expose the legacy of injustice that Senator Finch represents for the entire nation to see." This was no longer just a case. It had become his life's mission. The fear in the room hadn't vanished, but it was now joined by something else, a fragile, flickering ember of hope. For Elias Washington, the path of his revenge was now clear. It was not a path toward the destruction of a single man, but toward the demolition of an entire rotten system. The moment Elias Washington filed the initial lawsuit, the full weight of Senator Alastair Finch's power came crashing down. It was not a direct, public assault, but a campaign of silent, suffocating pressure, demonstrating with chilling efficiency how the system protected its own. Finch was a master of wielding power not like a sledgehammer, but like a web, invisible and intricate, ensnaring anyone who dared to struggle. The first and most immediate challenge was finding plaintiffs. Elias had identified several families who understood the stakes and were willing to lend their names to the lawsuit. But one by one, the threads of their lives began to unravel. Mr. Henderson, the father from the church meeting who worked at the local textile mill, was abruptly laid off, told his position was being eliminated due to restructuring. The mill's owner was a prominent Finch donor. Another mother, who ran a small, beloved bakery in the community, suddenly found that her flour and sugar suppliers, companies based 2 counties over, were canceling their contracts, citing vague logistical issues. The message was clear: step out of line and your livelihood will vanish. The most brutal blow was aimed at the Harrison family, who had bravely agreed to be the lead plaintiffs. One moonless night, they were woken by a sound that every Black family in the South knew and feared. It wasn't loud, just a strange, flickering crackle from outside. Mr. Harrison looked out the window and his blood ran cold. On their front lawn, a crude wooden cross was burning, its flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows against their small home. Elias visited them the next morning. The air still held the acrid smell of burnt wood and kerosene. The police had come and gone, their report filed with a distinct lack of urgency. The true damage wasn't to the lawn, which was scorched in a dark, ugly patch, but to the family itself. Elias sat with them in their small living room, the curtains drawn tight. He saw the deep, hollowed-out fear in the parents' eyes, but what broke his heart was the sight of their 7-year-old daughter, Lisa. She sat on the floor, unnaturally still, clutching a doll. She didn't cry. She just stared at the drawn curtains with a silent, profound terror that no child should ever know. "We can't, Mr. Washington," Mrs. Harrison whispered, her voice cracking. We can't put our baby through this. What if they come back?" Elias didn't argue. He couldn't. He could fight a law, but he couldn't promise to protect a little girl from the darkest parts of human nature. He left their home with a heavy heart, the image of that charred cross and Lisa Harrison's terrified eyes burned into his memory. While the community was being squeezed, Finch was orchestrating a masterful campaign in the press. He never mentioned Elias by name. Instead, he painted the lawsuit as the work of outside agitators, meddlers funded by Northern interests who didn't understand Virginia's unique culture and were trying to stir up trouble where there was none. In carefully worded interviews, he portrayed the plaintiffs not as brave citizens fighting for their rights, but as ungrateful pawns being used in a larger political game. He was positioning himself as the defender of the state against an invasive force, and Elias as its agent. The legal battle was just as disheartening. The case was assigned to Judge Marion Ashworth, a man who owed his federal appointment to Senator Finch's political maneuvering years ago. They were old friends who hunted together every fall. Unsurprisingly, Judge Ashworth immediately granted a motion to delay, filed by Finch's high-powered legal team. The case was buried in a mountain of procedural red tape, with hearings postponed and discovery requests endlessly challenged. Elias found himself working 18-hour days, not arguing the merits of his case, but just trying to keep it alive. He was drowning in paperwork, battling a system that felt designed to exhaust him, to bleed his resources and the community's will to fight. He felt the full, crushing force of the state's political and legal machinery working in perfect, terrible concert. This was the moment Elias understood, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, that his brilliance as a lawyer was not enough. He could have the most eloquent arguments, the most solid legal precedents, but it meant nothing if he could never get his day in court. Finch didn't need to defeat him in a fair fight. He just had to grind him down, to crush the spirit of the community, to ensure the case died a slow, quiet death in a procedural purgatory. The senator wasn't just a lawmaker, he was the gatekeeper of the entire system, and he had just locked the door and thrown away the key. Elias was fighting a ghost, a network of favors and threats that he couldn't see, but whose effects were devastatingly real. He was no longer just a lawyer, he was a target. Now here is where I have to pause for a second, because it's a moment that's easy to gloss over. It's one thing to fight a law in a courtroom, isn't it? It's another thing entirely to fight the shadow that law casts over every part of your life. When your friends are losing their jobs, when the safety of your child is threatened, when the very system you've put your faith in is turned against you, that's a different kind of war. This wasn't about legal strategy anymore for Elias. This was about survival. At his absolute lowest point, with the Harrison family's withdrawal and Judge Ashworth's delays, Elias felt the case, and his own resolve slipping away like sand through his fingers. He was reacting, always reacting to Finch's moves, constantly on the defensive. The weight of the community's fear and the crushing power of the state felt insurmountable. One bleak afternoon, desperate for a sliver of clarity, he drove out of town, leaving the suffocating piles of legal documents behind. He found himself on a deserted country road, pulled over by a fallow field overgrown with weeds. In the middle of the field stood the rotting skeleton of the Liberty-colored school. He got out of his car and walked towards it. The building was a study in decay. The roof sagged in the middle, the porch was collapsing, and the windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at nothing. He pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, decaying wood, and the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten lessons. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust. He walked through the main classroom, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He ran his hand over the rough surface of a student desk, its wood warped by years of rain and neglect. And there, faint but unmistakable, he saw a pair of initials he had carved into it as a bored 10-year-old, E.W. But standing there in the ruin of his own past, he didn't feel defeat. He felt a profound, startling clarification. He had been letting Finch define the battle, fighting on his opponent's chosen ground, the corrupt courts, the manipulated media. He was playing defense in a rigged game. He realized he couldn't just fight the law. He had to expose the man and the rotten system that had produced him. This visit to the school wasn't a surrender to the past. It was a reclaiming of his purpose. His strategy shifted in that moment, in that decaying classroom. The fire of his anger cooled into the hard, sharp focus of a new plan. He had to stop being a lone lawyer and become a community organizer. He had to stop reacting and go on the offensive. He went back to the church basement, but this time he didn't talk about legal motions or constitutional precedents. He talked about power. Working with the ever-resilient Mrs. Gable and other local leaders who refused to be intimidated, he began to build a movement from the ground up. They organized voter registration drives, setting up tables outside grocery stores and at community gatherings. The message was simple: if the men in power won't listen, we'll vote in new ones. More than that, they started their own schools. In church basements and community halls, they organized freedom schools. Volunteers, many of them retired teachers like Mrs. Gable, taught children not just reading and math, but Black history, civics, and the details of Senator Finch's bill. They educated the community, arming them not with anger, but with knowledge. They were taking back the narrative, defining for themselves what education and opportunity truly meant. The most critical piece of his new strategy, however, was to take the fight beyond Clarendon, beyond Virginia. Elias knew that Finch's power was absolute within the state, but he was also a man deeply concerned with his national reputation. Elias spent hours on the phone, calling in favors, until he connected with a young, fiercely ambitious journalist from a major northern newspaper named Daniel Pearson. Pearson was hungry for a big story, a story that could make his career, and he saw the potential in Elias' fight. Elias began to leak information to him, not just speculation or accusations, but facts. He provided copies of the state budget, highlighting the discriminatory funding patterns going back a decade. He gave him background on Finch's political allies and the businesses that backed him. He was carefully constructing a narrative for the national press, painting a picture of systemic injustice orchestrated by a powerful, duplicitous politician. The tide began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Daniel Pearson's articles started appearing, first as small, inside-page stories, then graduating to more prominent features. The story was no longer just a local legal dispute. It was becoming a national symbol of the ongoing struggle for civil rights in the South. Questions started being asked. Other national outlets began sniffing around. This was the turning point. Elias was no longer just a lawyer reacting to a single piece of legislation. He was the leader of a grassroots movement, a savvy political operator who was now fighting a war on two fronts, in the court of law and in the court of public opinion. He had stopped asking for a seat at the table and was now building his own. He was no longer just seeking to win a lawsuit. He was building the power to demand justice, to change the very ground on which the battle was being fought. The ghost of the Liberty School was no longer a source of pain. It had become his North Star. Elias knew two-pronged strategy was working. The freedom schools were thriving, empowering the community with knowledge and a sense of collective action. The voter registration drives were having a tangible effect, causing a stir in the state political machine. And Daniel Pearson's articles were generating a slow burn of national pressure that Finch and his allies could no longer ignore. The mounting public scrutiny forced Judge Ashworth's hand. Reluctantly, a trial date was finally set. For the first time in months, a genuine sense of hope began to permeate the community. Elias' legal team had secured what they believed was the key to their entire case, a star witness. His name was Arthur Abernathy, a quiet, unassuming man who had worked for 2 decades in the state budget office. He was a man of numbers, not politics, but he had a conscience. Disgusted by the blatant manipulation he had witnessed, he had reached out to Elias' team through a discreet intermediary. Abernathy had agreed to testify, and he was bringing proof. He had kept meticulous private notes and copies of internal drafts of the Educational Opportunity Act. Documents that would prove Finch's committee had deliberately and knowingly created the funding formula to underfund schools in Black communities. Abernathy's testimony would be undeniable, a voice from inside the machine itself. The night before his scheduled deposition, disaster struck. Elias was in his office, fine-tuning his questions for Abernathy when the phone rang. It was one of his junior lawyers, his voice frantic. "Elias, you need to see this. Turn on the news." Elias switched on the small black-and-white television on his credenza. The lead story on the late news was a mugshot. A grainy, washed-out photo of a terrified-looking Arthur Abernathy. The anchor reported, with a grim seriousness, that Abernathy had been arrested just hours earlier on charges of embezzlement. The charges stemmed from an audit conducted 20 years prior at a state agency where Abernathy had briefly worked as a young man. It was an old, forgotten discrepancy, a ghost from his distant past that had been resurrected with surgical precision. Elias' blood ran cold. It was Finch. It had to be. His investigators had dug through Abernathy's entire life until they found a splinter they could use to tear him apart. The witness was now completely discredited, his character assassinated before he could utter a single word of testimony. Worse, the charges, however flimsy, had terrified him into silence. His lawyer informed Elias the next morning that Abernathy would be pleading the fifth. His star witness was gone. This is what they call the all is lost moment for a reason. Because what do you do when the system you believe in, the law itself, is turned into a weapon against you? Elias had found a man brave enough to tell the truth, and the system had punished him for it. It was a message to anyone else who might consider stepping forward. As if on cue, the next blow landed. The very same day, Finch's legal team filed a motion to dismiss the entire case. Their argument was a classic, cynical piece of legal maneuvering, that the NAACP, as an organization, had no legal standing to sue on behalf of the students. They argued that only the individual families who had been harmed could be plaintiffs. They knew, of course, that those families had already been terrorized into withdrawing. It was a legal catch-22, designed to make the case simply disappear. The community's morale, so recently buoyed, plummeted. The news of Abernathy's arrest and the motion to dismiss spread like a virus, reigniting old fears and deepening the sense of powerlessness. All their work, the freedom schools, the voter drives, the newfound hope, seemed to evaporate overnight. The final gut punch came in a phone call from the NAACP's national office in New York. Elias' superior, a pragmatic man who understood the brutal calculus of civil rights litigation, was on the line. "Listen, Elias," he said, his voice laced with a weary sympathy that felt more like pity. "You've fought a good fight. You've raised awareness. But your witness is gone and this standing issue is a real threat. Finch's people are quietly offering a settlement. A few minor cosmetic changes to the bill, an amendment guaranteeing a review of funding equity in 5 years. We think you should take it. Declare victory and live to fight another day." Elias hung up the phone, the silence in his office roaring in his ears. He was utterly alone. He had fought the battle on Finch's terms and lost. He had fought it on his own terms, mobilizing the community, shaping the media, and the system had still found a way to crush him. He stared at the wall of law books, the fortress of logic that had been his life's work. It all seemed like a joke. The system wasn't just rigged, it was unbreakable. Giving up, taking the meaningless settlement, suddenly seemed like the only rational option left. The fire that had burned so brightly within him had been reduced to a cold, gray ash. Devastated and adrift, Elias found himself back in the damp church basement, mechanically packing legal pads and files into his worn leather briefcase. The optimistic charts and plans for the freedom schools still hung on the walls, now mocking him with their ambition. The settlement offer from the national office felt like a lead weight in his stomach, a win that was, in reality, a complete and total surrender. He was about to turn off the lights when a familiar voice cut through the silence. "Don't you dare." He turned. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, her posture as straight and unyielding as an oak tree. She wasn't looking at him with sympathy. Her eyes held a fierce, challenging glint. She was holding a large, dusty cardboard box, tied shut with twine. "I heard about Mr. Abernathy. I heard what they're telling you to do," she said, her voice firm. "You feel like you're fighting them in their world by their rules. The law is their house, son. They built it. They know all the secret passages and the trap doors." She walked toward him and placed the heavy box on a folding table with a solid thud. A cloud of dust puffed into the air, dancing in the dim light. "But the truth," she said, her gaze locking onto his, "the truth is ours." She untied the twine and lifted the lid. The box was filled to the brim with yellowed, brittle papers, old ledgers, and bound volumes of meeting minutes. They smelled of time and dust and patient determination. "For 40 years I was a teacher," Mrs. Gable explained, her hand resting protectively on the edge of the box. "And for 40 years we were told no. But we never stopped asking. And we never stopped writing it down, me and the teachers before me. We kept records of everything. Elias reached in and carefully lifted out a ledger. The pages were filled with neat, looping handwriting. He started to read. It was a meticulously kept record of official state correspondence, petitions, and rejected requests for the most basic supplies, dating back decades, long before he was even born. There were formal requests for new textbooks, denied. Petitions for a new furnace to replace the one that barely worked, denied. Pleas for chalk, for paper, for window panes to keep out the winter cold. All of them denied, year after year, with bureaucratic indifference. He spent the next several hours poring over the contents of that box, a historian excavating the hidden story of his own community. It was a painful, infuriating archaeology of neglect. But then, buried deep in a folder of school board records from the late 1940s, he found it. It was a single, typewritten memorandum, the paper so brittle it threatened to crumble in his hands. It was a response from the county school board to a detailed, desperate plea from the principal of the Liberty Colored School for a set of new history and literature books. The memo was a formal denial of the request, and at the bottom, above his typed name and title, was a signature, written in a confident, authoritative hand. Alastair Finch, junior board member. Elias' breath caught in his throat. He read the body of the memo, and his heart began to pound against his ribs. The crucial line, the justification for the denial, leaped off the page. Finch had written that providing new books to the colored schools was not a priority, because such an expense is not conducive to the maintenance of our state's educational traditions. Our state's educational traditions. It wasn't just a smoking gun. It was a Rosetta Stone for Alastair Finch's entire career. This single sentence, written by a young, ambitious politician 2 decades ago, was the philosophical seed for the Educational Opportunity Act. It proved, beyond any doubt, that his actions weren't a matter of isolated policy, but the culmination of a lifelong, systematic agenda of racial discrimination. It was irrefutable proof of intent, the one thing Elias had been desperately missing. The theme of his case, passed as prologue, was no longer a theory. It was a signed, documented fact. A new energy coursed through him, sharp and electric, chasing away the fog of defeat. His final plan crystallized, no longer hazy but forged into a weapon. This memo wasn't just a piece of evidence for the courtroom. It was the centerpiece of a much larger strategy. He would use it in court, of course. He would confront Finch with it on the stand. But its true power lay in the court of public opinion. He carefully made a copy of the memo. He knew exactly what to do with it. He would give this document to Daniel Pearson, the journalist. He would make sure that Alastair Finch's carefully crafted image as a benevolent statesman was shattered not just in Clarendon, not just in Virginia, but across the entire nation. He was no longer just putting a bill on trial. He was putting Alastair Finch's entire life, his entire legacy, on trial for the world to see. Mrs. Gable had given him more than just old papers. She had given him the truth, a weapon they had painstakingly cared for, waiting for a warrior to wield it. Everything came down to this one moment. Years of struggle, generations of pain, all focused on one man in a witness box. But Elias knew this wasn't just about one man. It was about dismantling a legacy of hate and building one of hope. The day of the climax arrived cloaked in the solemnity of a final judgment. The federal courtroom was packed to the rafters, a standing-room-only theater for the final act of a drama that had gripped the state. The community had turned out in force, their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. They filled the public benches, their presence a silent, powerful testament to the stakes of the day. They were joined by a throng of journalists from across the country, their pens poised, drawn by the scent of a story that had blossomed from a local dispute into a national referendum on justice. Daniel Pearson sat in the front row, a copy of that morning's newspaper folded on his lap. At the center of it all was Senator Alastair Finch, seated in the witness box. He projected an aura of complete composure, his silver hair immaculate, his posture ramrod straight. He looked not like a man on trial, but a king holding court, occasionally offering a small, condescending smile to his legal team. Then Elias Washington rose to begin his cross-examination. He approached the witness stand not with fire and fury, but with a chilling, surgical calm. His voice was low, measured, the voice of a scholar, not a brawler. "Senator Finch," Elias began, "you have presented yourself as a lifelong champion of education for all of this state's children. Is that correct?" "It is," Finch replied, his tone smooth as polished marble. "It has been the cornerstone of my public service." For the next hour, Elias calmly and methodically walked Senator Finch through his own career. He didn't accuse, he simply inquired. He used Finch's public speeches, his legislative achievements, his press releases. With each question, he built a portrait of the man Finch wanted the world to see: the benevolent patriarch, the wise statesman, the guardian of tradition. Finch, comfortable on this familiar ground, answered with confidence, his voice resonating with self-assurance. Then Elias changed his line of questioning. He began to ask about Finch's early career, his time as a junior member on the county school board in the late 1940s. A flicker of something, annoyance, caution, crossed the senator's face. "That was a long time ago, Mr. Washington," Finch said dismissively. "I hardly see the relevance." "Indulge me, Senator," Elias said softly. He produced a document, a yellowed piece of paper carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. It was the memo. "I'd like to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 47. Do you recognize this document?" Finch glanced at it, and for the first time his composure wavered. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "It appears to be an old board memorandum. I signed countless such documents." "You did indeed," Elias agreed. "This particular one is a response to a request from the Liberty Colored School for new history and literature books. Do you recall that request, Senator?" "Of course not," Finch scoffed. "That was 20 years ago." "Then allow me to refresh your memory," Elias said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing every ear in the courtroom closer. "In your official response, you denied the request, stating, and I quote, 'Such an expense is not conducive to the maintenance of our state's educational traditions.' Senator, could you please explain to the court what precisely you meant by our state's educational traditions?" Silence. A thick, heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The air crackled with tension. Finch's mask of serene statesmanship began to fracture. He shifted in his seat, his polished confidence evaporating under the glare of 100 pairs of eyes. That language," he stammered, suddenly flustered. It was standard boilerplate for the time. It simply referred to fiscal responsibility, to budgetary traditions. "Fiscal responsibility, Senator," Elias pressed, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Did that tradition of fiscal responsibility also apply to the new gymnasium built for the all-white Northwood High that same year, or the brand-new science equipment for Clarendon Secondary? Because the records show those expenditures were approved without hesitation." Finch was cornered. He began to contradict himself, his explanations growing more convoluted. He spoke of historical context, of different times, but his words were hollow. The facade was shattering. He wasn't just a politician being questioned. He was a man being forced to confront the ghost of his own bigotry in public. The smooth, charming statesman had vanished, replaced by a flailing, defensive hypocrite. At that exact moment, as if choreographed by fate itself, a court aide entered and handed a note to the judge, who then passed it to Finch's lead counsel. Simultaneously, a wave of motion rippled through the press gallery. Daniel Pearson's story, the story of the memo, of Finch's decades-long agenda, complete with a facsimile of the document itself, had just hit the wire. It was breaking on radios and appearing in afternoon newspaper editions across the country. The story in the courtroom and the story in the nation had converged. The cross-examination was over. Finch's career was over. He stumbled from the witness stand, his face pale, his reputation in ruins. Weeks later, the court issued its ruling. The Educational Opportunity Act was declared unconstitutional, a clear and undeniable violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. It was a landmark legal victory. Alastair Finch, exposed and disgraced, announced he would not seek re-election, his legacy forever tarnished. But for Elias Washington, the true resolution, the real victory, came months later. He stood on the steps of the State House, not as a lawyer this time, but as a citizen, and watched as the governor, under the mandate of the federal court, signed a new, truly equitable education funding bill into law. It wasn't a perfect bill, but it was a foundation. It was a promise. The final scene of his long journey unfolded on a bright spring afternoon a year later. Elias wasn't in a courtroom or an office. He was standing by the chain-link fence of the newly integrated West End Elementary School, watching children pour out for recess. He saw black children and white children chasing each other across a lush green lawn, their laughter echoing in the clear air. They were playing on brand-new equipment, a gleaming slide, and a set of colorful swings. And then he saw her, the little Harrison girl, Lisa. She was a year older, her face no longer a mask of silent terror. She was running, laughing, her hair flying behind her as she chased a red ball with two other little girls, one black, one white. She looked happy. She looked free. Elias felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He hadn't just won a case. He had broken a cycle. He hadn't sought revenge by destroying his enemy. The system and Finch's own history had done that. Instead, his victory was in what he had helped to build. It was in the sound of that little girl's laughter, in the sight of children learning and playing together, in the tangible reality of a promise finally being kept. The faint, painful echo of a boy shivering in a decaying schoolhouse had finally been silenced, replaced by the joyful noise of a new generation's future. His personal revenge was complete, not in the ashes of his enemy's career, but in the creation of a living, breathing legacy of hope. In the end, what Elias Washington achieved reminds us of something incredibly powerful. Revenge is so often imagined as a destructive force, a fire that consumes everything in its path, including the person who lit it. But what Elias created was something else entirely. It was a kind of restorative justice, a revenge not on a person, but on a system of beliefs. He understood that the most complete and lasting victory you can have over a legacy of hate is to build something beautiful and enduring in its place. He didn't just tear down the walls of injustice that Alastair Finch had spent a lifetime building. He used the space to lay the foundation for a school where children could learn together, a community that could heal together. He honored the promise he made to that little boy he once was, not by inflicting pain, but by creating opportunity. He understood that you don't heal a wound by mirroring the act that caused it. You heal it by planting a garden where the scar used to be. It's a profound shift in perspective, isn't it? To see revenge not as an act of destruction, but as an act of creation. It leaves me wondering, what does it truly mean to win against an enemy? Is it to watch them fall, or is it to make the world they wanted impossible, and the world you dream of a reality? What would you have done in Elias' shoes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your stories and perspectives are what make this community at Revenge Pains so vital. Thank you for joining me. I'm Serena, and I look forward to sharing another story with you soon.